Good morning.
Good morning.
So, I'd like to begin with everyone closing your eyes for a second. And I'd like you to visualize, at least as far back as you can remember, the first time you celebrated Easter. And I'd like you to remember what was most fun about that and what significance that holds to you today. And what traditions were most paramount to you during that time. Okay, I hope you didn't stare into an empty black void. So, how does this relate to today? Well, first of all, happy Easter.
Thank you.
And second of all, I am going to be dissecting several traditions around the world and from different faiths that share some inspiration from Easter, and ultimately we will be seeing how much connection they have to Christianity and the resurrection of Christ. So, as I go through each of these traditions, I'd like you to ask yourself, okay, how much connection does this have to Christianity? So, let's go back several thousand years, and we'll start with Greek traditions. Now, the breaking of eggshells actually started in Greece, and they dyed their eggs red. And they broke the shells to let the dye escape, which they considered letting blessings escape. And to them, this symbolized Christ bleeding on the cross. So now we have some very explicit connections already, but as I will continue, these aren't all concrete, and you'll see why. So another tradition in ancient Greece is that the eggs were tapped together very lightly, kind of like a toast of eggs, you will, where one person says, Christ is risen, and the other says, he is risen indeed. Now if we go back a little bit later to a culture that, from a certain point of view, ripped off the Greeks. Let's go to the Romans. Now, this may seem a little bit odd, considering their history in the New Testament, but once early Christianity was introduced to Rome, they did have dyeing of eggs. Now, they actually dyed them bright colors, and this was to encourage growth of the sun. And this was to tip the equinox balance to light. And they had several different sources of their egg colors. These dandelions and onion skins for orange, they had carrot tops for yellow, they had heather for pink, and they had madder root for red, and then several different berries for blue. And one other method for coloring was by boiling them with other foods. And that sounds much more fun than the vinegar method that's used today. And Easter, the word, is derived from Astara, which I will discuss in great detail in a little bit. But first, this spelling is E-O-S-T-R-E, and this refers to the direction of the sunrise, the east. And so the Romans, they worshipped Flora, who was the goddess of flowers, and this was 2,000 years ago. And they honored her with the Flora Lila festival to be sure that she made the flowers bloom every spring. And this was celebrated from April 28th to May the 3rd. And what they did is they gathered spring flowers and offerings to her, and there was this contest held where the young men were contestants who tried to place this wreath on her giant statue. And the winner, whoever got the wreath placed on first, was assured good luck for the rest of the year. Now, this reminds me of a scene in the first Captain America where he tips over the flag that he has to get. And I'm thinking, well, why don't they just tip over the statue? There's always a loophole, I suppose. So, speaking of Astara, if we go a little later on to early Anglo-Saxon and early Germanic faiths, then we can go to Wiccan and Asatru traditions. Now this is really fun to me because my parents are pagan, and a lot of these traditions I'm very familiar with. So this is something that actually resonates with me much more than Easter. So I have some personal connection to this. So first of all, let's begin with the vernal equinox. That is what a star celebrates. So in Latin, the equinox actually translates to equal night, with equi meaning equal and nox meaning night. So it's important to understand that a star and Easter don't fall in the same month every year, because it celebrates equinox clearly, and that's usually before Easter. So this is actually because in Asatru tradition, the star is on the full moon 1 month after the equinox. And so later on, up until modern times, this would explain why Easter is sometimes in March and sometimes in April. And also because written records weren't as precise as they are today. So let's start with the Wiccan perspective. Now, for a star, Wiccans honor the marriage of the goddess and the god, while pagans save the marriage for Beltane. And the main spelling for Ostara is O-S-T-A-R-A, but other spellings are E-O-S-T-A-R-A and E-O-S-T-R-E. Now, a lot of these spellings just have to do with the fact that they were formed in separate parts of Europe. So, what is a star exactly? Well, it's named after the Anglo-Saxon goddess of the spring. And her sacred symbols are the eggs and hares, and she is a maiden goddess. Now you may be wondering what that is. Well, there are 3 different types of goddesses in Wiccan traditions, and the maiden goddess is the younger goddess that represents youth and virginity and exuberance, which works very well for spring. Now her runes, which are basically like letter symbols that were used for written language before Latin was popularized, are Bark and Dig. Now, and these are associated with her Sabbath and Blot and Asatru, and that is her blessing. So let's start with Bjark, and that is a rune of the earth, and that's associated with several Norse goddesses. And then Dag means day, but not in the daylight day, actually in the sense of a 24-hour period. Now it's important to understand that there's no historical basis in Celtic mythology for a star. So this likely spread through tall tales and passings around the campfire, because, like I previously stated, written documents weren't all too popular back then. So, let's get to some other differences between Wiccan and Asatru celebrations of the star. So, Asatru priests bless the newly sown crops, and they share colored eggs. But one difference between this and another pagan tradition is that one pagan tradition is to have boiled eggs, and the white of most normal eggs, is that that represents the winter, and that winter solstice. So that represents when it was freezing and very cold and the white snow. And then when you eat that away, you have the egg yolk, and that's yellow and golden and represents the return to light of the vernal equinox. So let's go through several of the different rituals that covens might undergo. Now, one is hiking through a cave, which is referred to as the cosmic egg, because, okay, imagine going through the depths of a very dark cave, and you enter back into the outside world, and it feels like rebirth in a sense. Because ultimately, that's what a star is a celebration of. It's a celebration of rebirth and a return to balance. So again, ask yourself, what kind of connections might this have to Christianity? It's interesting. Now, another star tradition is stepping through the bride's belt. And this is a belt woven from the previous year's meadow grasses, and it's fastened into a circle for a coven to jump through one at a time. And sometimes a priest might stand as a guardian to make the crossing difficult, and the last person to come across the circle has the most difficult time because the members join the priest in keeping it from coming through. So that would represent rebirth and a return to the light and a new start after the winter. So now let's go to Buddhist traditions. And there are several names for these. There's Visak in Sri Lanka, and there's Visakha Puja in Thailand. And these are held during the entire month of May to celebrate the birth, enlightenment, and death of the first Buddha, Sarada Gautama. And people decorate their homes with paper lanterns during this time. Now it's important to note that the Thailand tradition is actually named in part after Siddhartha Gautama's mother, which I found very interesting. So, going back through East Asia, there is the Japanese celebration of Buddha's birthday on April 8th, and a Kembutsu festival. And in this festival, small flowers and tea are poured over baby Buddha statues. And because of this close proximity to some flower seasons, this is known as Flower Day. And another Japanese tradition is Shumbun no Hi. And this celebrates the equinox in Japan, but it's also a Japanese form of Dias de los Muertos, because not only do they celebrate nature, but they also celebrate visitations to family cemeteries. And families may hold picnics to celebrate the life of past loved ones. Now let's go to Hindu traditions. Now the Hindus, some would celebrate a 3-day festival called the Holi Festival, and this is in March. And this dates back to an age-old legend of this witch Holika, and she was burned at the stake for her apparent evils. Now, to prevent others from hearing the shrieks, the people at first made noise and yelled back and cursed at her to prevent people from hearing her. But then they realized, okay, after her life, whether she is reincarnated or however she continues through her being, that she may still continue evil. So they threw dates and fried beans into the fire to keep her fed. And maybe then she might have some positive existence. So on the night before Holi, so a pot is filled with beans and water, and this is placed in a hole in the ground. And then a bonfire is lit here. And so the villagers initially yell and curse at the bonfire to commemorate. Then they toss coconuts, dates, and fried beans. I don't know how they can fit a coconut into that. And so these ashes, once the bonfire is complete, are buried in a field to improve the crops for that year. And these are considered very sacred. So after this, on the actual days of Holi, the families prepare meals and they exchange them, kind of like another Mexican tradition during Christmas. And they go from house to house and share their different meals. Now what's very unique about this one is that that the host usually marks the forehead of the guest with a dab of colored powder. Now the different colors have different significances. Red represents fertility and love, green is happiness and life, and blue is determination, while yellow is knowledge. And in more recent times, there has been a full festival to commemorate these different colors, where they throw these powders into the air. It's actually quite a spectacle. If you ever get the chance to go, I mean, I'd love to just to see that. It is stunning. So, so speaking of this powder, the children fill bamboo tubes with it, and they blow it over ongoers and the streets because, well, they're children. What else do they have to do? And some believe this to be the origin of April Fools. Well, another April Fool's connection would derive from France, when the French king Charles IX adopted the Gregorian calendar. So that changed New Year to January 1st from March 25th to April 1st. And as a sort of harmless retaliation, people just did pranks on each other. They did things like having candy boxes with straw or bouquets of onions. I don't know how you could pull it off. And these victims were called April Fish in France. And this moved on to other parts of Western Europe. In Scotland, they're called April Gawks. Now, let's move on to the Jewish traditions. Now, there are several of these that are held in different increments of spring that all have some relation to Easter. Now, the first is Tu B'Shavat, and this is a Jewish celebration in March that translates to the New Year for trees, and it's celebrated when the sap begins to flow in them, and it's dated 15 Shabbat on the Hebrew calendar, and it told if the fruit, which according to Jewish law cannot be eaten until the 4th year, is ready to be picked. And it's on that day, it's custom to eat fruit of trees native to Israel, like dates, figs, raisins, nuts, and St. John's bread. And up until midnight, some Jewish people will spend that time just studying and reciting passages of the Hebrew Bible that all involve trees and fruit. And whatever fruit they are reading or reciting about, they have to eat. And this is believed to keep the divine blessing in the world. And a more intricate celebration is Purim. Now, Purim is held on the 14th Adar in the Hebrew calendar. And this is told from the Bible's book of Esther, or Megillah. So this actually dates back before Christ 600 years. So this involves the prime minister of Persia, Haman, who is very corrupt, becoming angry at Mordecai, a Jew, for refusing to pay homage. So, as a result, Haman convinces the king, Ahasuerus, to grant power to kill all the Jews in the land by casting lots. And Purim means lots in Hebrew. So Queen Esther, who the book is named after, was also Jewish, but she was also Mordecai's cousin. So she hatched a plan to save the Jews by exposing Haman's wickedness to the king. So the king warned the Persian Jews, who were thankfully all saved. So Haman was later hung for treason. So later on, this celebration begins with a service reading of the Megillah. And then every time Haman is mentioned, listeners drown him out with noisemakers. And the traditional noisemaker is a graybeard. And coins are collected during this service, and they're donated to charity as a reminder of the tax collected to support the early temples. Now, shapmons, which are fruit, cookies, and candy, are given to the poor, or at least one friend during this time. And now we get to a tradition after Easter, Shavuot, which is 50 days after Passover, marks the end of the grain harvest. And this is when the first fruits of the season were originally brought to Mount Zion. So that is what's celebrated during that time. And it's said that the heavens are to open up for prayers, so at midnight. Now, if we go to very early Christianity, there are some slight differences from today. So originally, Easter was observed on Passover, which, considering that was when the Last Supper was, that would make sense, until 325 AD. So the name for Easter in other languages actually doesn't derive from a star in French, Italian, and Dutch. It derives from Pesach, which is Hebrew for Passover. So the earliest Lent records show that Lent actually lasted 40 hours in the 2nd century. So this would be from the afternoon of Good Friday to Easter morning, instead of 40 days. So why was this? Well, 40 days would represent the time that Jesus fasted before preaching, while 40 hours would represent his time in the tomb before the resurrection. So in Roman Catholic churches, there's a Mass for every day of Lent, and the priests wear purple robes specifically for those days. So Shrove Tuesday, which you may know is the final day before Lent, was actually referred to in some parts of Western Europe, particularly France, as Pancake Tuesday, since just having eggs, milk, and butter was originally prohibited. So people figured, hey, if we can't have eggs, milk, and butter by themselves, why don't we make pancakes? So, and then this eventually led to Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, which isn't too obscure. I guess you can consider it a little odd, but I wouldn't call it obscure. But what's interesting is that it was introduced into the U.S. in 1766. And speaking of Mardi Gras, in New Orleans, there's a tradition of burying the sardine, which actually is not a sardine. It's a thin slice of meat into the ground. And this is to represent letting things go for Lent. And a popular British tradition is on the 4th Sunday, is Mothering Sunday. And this was initially allowing the younger unmarried servants to return home to their home church before Easter, and gifts were placed in the altar. So currently, children are expected to bring gifts to their mothers and be especially helpful to them on this day. So in Britain, Mother's Day is more closely tied to Easter. So let's look at some popular Easter symbols. So we have the egg, clearly, that represents rebirth. And the rolling eggs custom, which you may see at the White House, actually originated from Greek and Roman societies, and that represented the rolling of the stones from Jesus' tomb. Now, if we'll go to some other traditions, in Poland, there is Wielkanoc, where the head of the house cuts up a colored egg at Easter dinner for each family member. And they greet each other with, we wish you a happy Alleluia, before eating these. And eggs are actually very unique in their use in different parts of the world. Like a Danish tradition is to eat hard-boiled eggs dipped in mustard sauce. And the mustard sauce would represent the light. And an Italian tradition involves Easter breads baked with embedded eggs. And then a Swedish tradition involves children dressing as witches to scare them off. And fireworks are also set off for this purpose. And then we have Spanish and Jerusalem traditions, which are more closely tied to Christianity. And in Spain, men carry statues of Jesus and Mary under these platforms. And in Jerusalem, the devout would follow the Via Dolorosa, which is the sorrowful road, which would be the path to Jesus' crucifixion. Now, as for German and Austrian traditions, one involves masked boys begging for gifts, and in return they would get sausages and eggs, and they would go from house to house doing this on Shrove Tuesday. And then particularly in Austria, there are dancers in a procession, and they are showered with hemp seeds. And once they receive the hemp seeds, they jump as high as they possibly can. And that encourages growth during the spring equinox. And so keeping all these diverse traditions in mind, let's return to that question. Do they really all have a major concrete connection to Christ? No. Thank you. I want to do that. So, if that's the case, why would I search for one? And why would so many other people try to find connections between multiple faiths? Why would I have that drive that goes back to some of the UU principles to encourage spiritual growth? Well, let's go to holism. What is holism? Well, according to Oxford, it's this theory that parts of a whole are an intimate interconnection, such that they cannot exist independently of the whole, or cannot be understood without reference to the whole, which is thus regarded as greater than the sum of its part. Well, that's an Oxford definition. It's a little bit wordy. What does that mean? Well, it means that everything is connected. You may have heard that term from the Douglas Adams novel, Dirk Gently's A Holistic Detective Agency, which, if you don't know, is about this detective who he solves crimes by connecting the things that don't even involve the crime, that are completely disconnected. And I would highly recommend the book, or watching the BBC series. It's very funny. Anyway, that's completely disconnected. Hey, there you go. Anyway, that's where you may have heard that term. And this, from a certain view, has led to apophenia, which was a term coined by psychiatrist Klaus Conrad in 1958. And this was part of a study of beginning schizophrenia stages. I think I've seen 3 heads somewhere. Anyway. So that seems a little extreme just for comparing religions, right? Well, think about it this way. From an evolutionary perspective, humans misinterpret error over succumbing to fear of danger. That's instinct. And this pattern is recognized in all biotic factors, even to microorganisms. And that is ultimately because everything that does not have a clear scientific answer always returns to that fear of the unknown. Where do we go after we die? It always comes back to that, doesn't it? Well, if you have a very strong faith, it might not. But let's look at it this way. What else do all these other faiths that I discussed previously have in common? And one thing, especially of Astera traditions, is the representation of rebirth. Now, this can be considered a callback to Christ's resurrection, but it can also be considered the growth of the vernal equinox of spring. And this can be a return to balance. Now, balance doesn't necessarily have to be opposites coexisting. I mean, a yin-yang can be different parts of the whole that disagree with each other, but understand their differences and set them aside. And this can be metaphorically attributed to many different things. So, let's look a little bit further. What might this have to do with Jesus' teachings? Well, if you were here for my last talk, I did a scientific and historical analysis of the existence of Christ. And his teachings can be summed up with the 12 powers, which include life, faith, understanding, power, 12 powers, imagination, strength, wisdom, love, will, release, order, and zeal. Now you think, all these powers can be cultivated through the ideas of rebirth that are presented through these traditions. So, in some way, there is a connection, not necessarily in the resurrection of Jesus, but in his teachings. So, if you really think about it, and think about rebirth, and think about things being holistic, and all of that, life is really a miracle. I mean, going back to Peter's talk about the Big Bang and how on a microscopic, subatomic scale things had to happen just right. I mean, might be referred to as the Goldilocks sequence, where life is really a miracle, if you think about it. The fact that we are here right now is a miracle. And what else could be a miracle? Well, for that, I think you already know. Thank you.